Announcement. Next Tuesday, we'll be holding our 5th annual Lavender graduation at 4 o'clock in Kirchhoff 22, 15, and 16, and it's a time for us to celebrate our LGBTQ and allied graduates. So if you're interested in participating, please contact the center and come join us for the festivities. Today, we're happy to have as our guest speaker Mia Mingus. Mia is a queer, physically disabled woman of color, Korean transracial and transnational adoptee writer, organizer, and community caretaker. She was raised in St. Croix, U.S. Virgin Islands, and spent 12 years in Atlanta, Georgia, and has recently moved to Berkeley, California. Yay, Berkeley, my hometown. Through her work on disability justice, reproductive justice, queer liberation, and transformative justice, she recognizes the urgency and barriers for oppressed communities to work together and build alliances for liberation. She believes that love, care, and kindness are political, and though her work for liberation changes and evolves, her roots remain firmly planted in ending sexual violence. Mia was co-executive director of Spark Reproductive Justice Now until January of 2010. She is a founding member of the Disability Justice Collective and was a member of the Atlanta Transformative Justice Collaborative for 4 years. She is currently part of an experiential project, To the Other Side of Dreaming, to document her journey to creating collective access and home. Mia was a 2005 New Voices Fellow, was named one of Advocate Magazine's 40 Under 40 for 2010, one of the 30 most influential Asian Americans under 30 in 2009 by Angry Asian Man, and one of Campus Pride's top 25 LGBT favorite speakers for their 2009 Hot List. Mia was honored with the 2008 Creating Change Award by the National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, a Unity and Community Award by the Unity Fellowship of Christ Church Atlanta, and a Community Activist Award for her dedication and steadfast activism in 2007 by ZAMI. Please help me welcome Mia Mingus.
Do I wear this?
We'll get you all fixed up here.
I'm going to take this off now, actually, because I will have to take it off later. Okay, I should just put it anywhere.
Yep.
Hello? Okay.
There you go.
Thank you.
Put this in your pocket or where?
Can I just set it right here? Hi. Hi. How are you all doing? Oh, I feel so special right now. Thank you all so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here, and I am so excited to talk about queerness and disability with you all. There's so much that we could talk about, so I know that we could talk for, well, I could talk for weeks and weeks and months and still not be satisfied. So I'm really excited to be here. And I just want to say thank you also to the folks who have brought me here and the folks who have made it possible for me to be here. Everyone has been so nice. And the food was delicious this morning, or this afternoon. I always like it when there's good food. And I also want to open up that I also would like to bring into the room the other folks who have made it possible for me to be here, including the people who built this building, the folks who care for it every day and clean the floors and clean the bathrooms, as well as the folks here in this country as well as around the globe who are being violently exploited for their resources and labor so that we can exist in this lovely air-conditioned building with access to clean water and food and able to sit in relative safety from military attacks or the police barging in. And including and honoring the Native and First Nations communities upon whose land we are currently on and whose occupation and genocide have also allowed us to be here. For this too, I firmly believe must also be a part of our queer liberation. I would like to call into the room the many other comrades who move with me in this work for revolution and liberation, especially other queer, disabled women and trans people of color. I do this work with and for them, as well as for those yet to come. And I do this work because it's what I wish I had had when I was growing up and coming into political consciousness. And I want to bring them into the room because I want to seriously resist and challenge and start to shift a culture of celebrityism in our movements. I don't think that it's helpful for anybody, and to shift away from individualism and more towards collective thinking, because I cannot and I do not do this work alone. It's built on the backs of queers, of women of color, disabled folks, adoptees, poor people, so many others who have come before me. And it's taken so much for me to even be able to be here as I am about to speak to you about queerness and disability. It has taken so much for us to even get to the point where disability and queerness would even be said in the same breath. Has taken so much for disability and queerness to be a worthy political subject to speak on. Has taken so many, in particular, I would say queer disabled folks who have been pushing to be their whole selves, challenging the ableism within queer community and the homophobia within disabled community. Has taken so much for a queer disabled woman of color adoptee to be given the mic and listened to, so I feel very honored. And I also think it's important to say that I cannot speak from anything else but my own lived experience. I am somebody who is physically disabled, and so that is how I enter in through disability, and I certainly work to be in solidarity with folks who have lots and lots of different types of disabilities, but definitely don't know all of those histories, don't know all of those lived experiences, as well as I'm Korean, and that's where I enter into being Asian, and so can't speak for all Asian and Pacific Islander folks as well. You would think it goes without saying, but I feel like it is important to say because of the way that we iconize people, right? And so I cannot speak for all disabled people, cannot speak for all adoptees or all queer people. I cannot and do not speak for all queer disabled women of color or all queer people of color, and I certainly most definitely do not speak for the entire disability justice movement or any movement for that matter. I know that the disability justice movement is very new in a lot of ways, and like all movements, the disability justice movement is large and it's vast, and it has folks that are doing disability justice work in lots and lots of different ways, and that are all exciting and that look very different because they're grounded in people's own lived experiences, grounded in people's own geographic location. I would like to also add that I do this work in service of community. All of this work that I do in my speaking and my writing, and I tell my story with the knowing that our stories, and I truly believe this, that our stories are tools for liberation. I speak knowing that all of our voices are important. I speak to leave evidence for the people like me who are searching for reflection and recognition and a yes, we exist. I speak to leave evidence for folks who have been told that disability is not as important as race, or that gender justice will have to wait until after class equity is won. For folks who have been told that how you feel is less important than what you think. For those who don't have the luxury of being able to rattle off 10, even 5 writers or books that reflect their identities or experiences. For those of us who straddle the lines between multiple oppressed communities. For those of us who are working to end violence for all of us, not just some of us. For those of us who truly believe that no one's safety is more important than anyone else's safety, even when we feel unsafe. For queer people of color building family and home in ways that feed and honor us, and for disabled queer women of color struggling to love ourselves and each other. I'm here this afternoon, well, one, because I was asked to speak. I'm so excited to follow the amazing lineup of folks that you all have had, but particularly because I want us to keep building together and keep reaching out together to each other, because I want us to start seeing each other as comrades, as fellow ordinary people who have changed the course of history because they risked working together for a better world, because they knew that they needed each other. I want us to start seeing each other as fellow movement builders, as community. I want us to start thinking about each other as people to be in solidarity with, to be radical allies, or I like to say comrades to, people to be accountable to. I know oftentimes we go through the world and we think, how can I get them to join my struggle? How can I get them to be supportive of the work that I'm doing? But what if we shifted our thinking to the folks that we meet and we think, how can we be in support of the work that they are doing and the struggles that they're facing? And And I know, hopefully all of you here know, that we all have a responsibility to end oppression and cycles of violence, and hopefully we know that our lives are not separate from the people in this room, the folks who cook and grow our food, the people who made our clothing that we're wearing right now, the folks who assembled our computers, who vacuumed this floor, as well as the communities in Wisconsin and Egypt and Haiti and Japan and Palestine and more. I'm going to remember to drink water because I forget and not spill it on me. So I'd like to start our time off together with a moment of breath and awareness for this work and what we'll be talking about. I want to remind us of our bodies and to honor them as we hold our own stories and our histories. I feel like in this work, a lot of times things are very heady and we forget to bring our bodies into the conversation, and I think that's one of the strengths that disability justice brings to us again and again and again, is to not leave our bodies out, that we can't, for many of us, we can't forget that we're in our bodies. And I want to acknowledge that what we're holding in this room, or what I'm holding, trying to hold with you, is ending oppression and violence. And I don't think that that's easy work. And I think it's important to recognize the toll that it takes on our bodies, our hearts, our minds, and our spirits day in and day out. I want to acknowledge the many of us who are here, that are here in this room, who are survivors of one form of violence or another. Many of us have been witness to violence. Many of us have been violent, have caused harm, colluded in violence, willingly or not, whether it's through our tax dollars or through actual actions that we took. And all of us, I think, have been impacted by a culture of relentless violence, right, that feeds off of oppression as well, that's used in service of oppression. And I would like to acknowledge that not only are we carrying legacies of violence with us, and abuse and oppression and privilege and trauma every day, right, into our work, into our relationships with each other, into this room, but that we also bring legacies of resistance and survival and love in the face of silence and erasure. And those carry us through all the time. And we bring those into this room as well, along with our other legacies. We bring legacies of resiliency that are deep and strong, which we are a part of. And I think in all of our work, it is our responsibility to grow and cultivate resiliency, not just resist, right? That we must grow and cultivate resiliency for ourselves individually and collectively as much as we are resisting. We can't just fight against the world that we currently have, but we must also be working to create the kind of world that is inspired by our deepest desires for ourselves, our families, and our communities. And I say families broadly. That includes chosen families, situational families. But I think it's from this place, from a place of resiliency, where I would like us to always start, from the world that we want and the world that we desire. I always think it's important to say that I am here today as a queer, disabled, Korean woman, transracial, and transnational adoptee raised in a U.S. territory in the Caribbean, none of which are more or less important. For me, these are not just descriptive terms, but they're also political identities and political experiences based out of my own and other people's lived experiences. And I understand them, all of them, to be powerful ways of moving through and understanding the world. It's not like, oh, I just happen to be disabled, or, oh, I just happen to be an Asian woman. I think all of them are political. And so when I speak about queerness, it inherently includes a collective anti-oppression and particularly race, disability, gender, and class analysis, because queerness is raced and gendered and classed. And indeed, to be as able-bodied as possible is in so many ways to be as white and straight and heterosexual as possible, especially when we understand that one of the main reasons queer people are seen as less than is because we do not fit one of the main criteria to be able-bodied, the ability to reproduce. As we connect different systems of oppression, I think we can simultaneously understand them to be intimately connected and made out of the same fabric. To speak about queerness doesn't mean that I'm not speaking about race or disability or living in the South, but in fact it's inherent, or it's what I like to call ground level, that they are all part of what it means to be queer, because that is how I experience my life. What I've learned from living in the South has helped me to survive as a queer person. What I have learned from being adopted has helped me to survive as a disabled person. To me, queer liberation includes ending ableism, white supremacy, heterosexism, the gender binary, economic exploitation, population control, colonization, male supremacy, war and militarization, and the ownership of children and land, and so much more. How are y'all doing? Good? Am I going too fast? When I get excited, I go fast. If I'm going too fast, just give me a little hand wave or something. So when I think about my queerness, I think that it is always changing. It's always evolving. It's always deepening. Who I was as a queer person, 5 years ago, is not who I am now. It grows with me. It changes me, and I change it. And I love being queer so much. I love getting to talk on it. It's so exciting. But that my queerness is informed by and intimately connected to being all of these things that I've been talking about, right? To being disabled, to being an adoptee, a person of color, my middle-class upbringing, to being a woman, to being raised outside of the continental U.S., to growing up in a rural feminist community. And queerness is a part of everything I do. How could it not be? And I want to just say have a moment just that when I say queer, I think it means lots and lots of different things when people use the word queer, and just to be specific. So sometimes when people say queer, they mean just descriptively, right? They mean it as an umbrella term to encapsulate everybody who's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, pansexual, and then I think it's like a growing alphabet soup, right? The list just goes on and on. Some people include intersex, some people don't, depending on where you are. Allies are included in that, sometimes they're not. But it's usually, right, in a lot of ways in this first way, it's used descriptively. It's just to say, oh, so-and-so is a lesbian, or so-and-so is gay. So we would say so-and-so is queer, so-and-so is queer. So the second way I think that queerness gets used is as a political term. So people say, oh, Lisa is queer, or, all I can think of is the name brother, and that's not a word, that's not a name. Bianca is queer. And meaning as a political term, right? Meaning that they have an analysis about heterosexism, that they understand the connections between transphobia and homophobia, that they stand in solidarity with other queer people, that whether they specifically or descriptively, right, identify as lesbian, they have a solid understanding of solidarity and connection with folks who are gay, folks who are bisexual, folks who are transgender. Making sense? Right? So sometimes they get used, and then they get used interchangeably all the time. We just say so-and-so's queer, and we don't really know what they're talking about. And I know probably all of you in this room know that there's lots of folks who are queer who are not queer, right? There's lots of people who are lesbian who maybe don't understand the connections between other queer people. But when I say queer, I mean that I am both descriptively queer, and I think about it as a political identity, right? It's something, a politic, a way that I move through the world. It's intentional. So I'm using it in both of those ways at the same time. And I'll try to distinguish that if I ever do want to pull them apart. And I don't think it's to say that one is better than the other. I think it's more just to distinguish what we mean and to be specific around what we're actually saying. And when we actually use the term queer, what do we mean? I think there's many reasons why people can or cannot be politically queer, and a lot of those are really valid reasons that have to do with violence and being targeted, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not to say that folks who are descriptively queer are not as good as people who are politically queer by any means. Is that making sense? Yes? Okay. I feel always like I'm in a workshop. Making sense? Like I'm going to talk to you all. We're going to have a conversation right now. So whenever I do this work, I like to say that this work is part of who I am, and I am a part of this work. It's very hard for me to pull those two things apart. That part of doing this work, I think, is sharing our stories and learning from them. And like I said, I believe that our stories are tools for liberation. All of our stories, however painful or embarrassing or privileged or seemingly boring they may be, right? Oftentimes we think the only people that have stories are the people who are oppressed, and I don't think that that's true. I think our stories of privilege actually can help us learn a tremendous deal about how to end oppression and what we're fighting against and the conditions that we're living under. learning to understand my experiences and my story as valuable and complex as something outside of wrong. It let me find my breath. I always say it let me breathe. Understanding disability as beautiful and desirable and a powerful way of moving through the world, finding disability political writing, it saved my life. Finding queer people of color that were political in community, finding political queer people of color community in Atlanta helped me to survive. It helped me to love myself outside of a white-dominated and centered queer movement. Political queer people of community changed what I could even imagine was possible. And really, I think in so many ways, being queer is about having the courage and the desire to imagine more, to imagine what can be, the possibility for a different way to desire and love and be in relationship with each other. And I think we must be willing to have hard conversations as queer people with each other about how we are different as queer people. It helps us to expand what queerness even is, to see that there are many, many different ways to be queer, that we can't just decide to come together as queer people and expect that we're all going to be united and work together, or that we'll even feel comfortable. And we cannot be afraid to do our own work at our own tables. And yes, there's much work to be done out there, right, for folks who aren't queer, who aren't queer friendly. Yes, that's important too, most definitely. But I think we are outsiders here as well, because really there is no out there. For those of us living with multiple oppressed identities, we know this very well inside and out. And as adoptees in particular, we know this well, especially as transracial and transnational adoptees. As people who straddle many different communities, so much of our work must be done with people in our own communities, right? People at Grand Valley State University, people who are in our classes that we're going to school with, our families, folks who are our friends. And we do this work for our very survival because oftentimes we have no choice but to. There is literally nowhere else to go. Our homes are rarely comfortable, and I know queer folks know something about that too. So, to me, there are so many ways that we are queered. We are queered by our bodies, our histories, our traumas, our desires. When I think about my queerness, I think about desire on a broad scale, right? I don't just think about who I desire sexually or romantically, and romantically is such an arbitrary word. What does that actually mean? Where are those lines between romantic and friend? Who knows? But I also think about my desire as a whole, right? I think about my desire for a better world. I think about my desire for family and home that feeds me. I think about desire for community that can hold love and accountability and access all at the same time. As a disabled person who doesn't desire to be able-bodied, I am at once queer, at once confusing. How could I not want to be as able-bodied as I possibly can? How can I not want to at least look as able-bodied as I possibly can? How can I desire to be disabled? How can I desire to be in the body that I have? I think even just the idea of shifting one's understanding of disability as not wrong is so hard for people to do because we have been told that time and time again, right? That even those of us who are disabled should be trying to not be disabled. We should be trying to cure ourselves, fix ourselves, make ourselves seemingly less disabled so that able-bodied people will feel comfortable. I'm queered by my body. I didn't have the right kind of body. It was wrong. It was something that needed to be fixed. It was tragic, something to be pitied, something that was undesirable. As I wrote recently, quote, as someone whose body has been and is still seen as public property to be commented on by strangers, given unsolicited advice or asking intrusive questions, to be stared at and made fun of, I fight daily to claim my body. Growing up as a disabled child, I went from doctors to brace makers, from surgery to physical therapy to doctors. And I ached for people who looked like me, people who moved like me, people who could tell me that my body was beautiful the way that it was and no surgery would ever make me able-bodied, just as sure as no surgery would ever make me white. The idea of trying to make a brace that went from my heel to my hip so that it could be, quote, hidden underneath my clothes so that boys wouldn't detect it was at once an attempt to make me more desirable by making me seem less disabled, and an assumption about who should desire me and who I should desire. It wouldn't make me more of a girl or a woman, something I never really completely understood or felt like, unquote. My disability queered me, is what I always say, and what I still think to this day. I mean, I know people say there are straight disabled people, but whatever, that they exist. But I believe that my having a disability was totally queer. And having disability, it didn't really seem to fit with being a woman. It didn't really seem to fit with attracting boys or having children or getting married. I never saw disabled women in the media being desired, let alone disabled women of color, let alone queer disabled women of color. Ableism, the system of oppression that maintains able-bodied supremacy, got leveraged in the service of heterosexism, in the service of white supremacy, in the service of misogyny. People assume that I'm queer because I am disabled. People assume that it must be easier to find partners in the queer community, as if the ableism in the queer community is any less common or severe, which we know is not true. As if straight people are the only people who can be ableist. This is obviously not true again. And in fact, it is oftentimes ableism that keeps me the most isolated from queer community, from people of color queer community, from queer API community. Places are not accessible. Notions of queer bodies never seem to include people with disabilities. And actually, bodies is something that I think we're very uncomfortable talking about in the queer community in and of itself. I feel like most of my experiences within queer community have been about queer folks trying to do an able-bodied way of desire just in a queer way, but not actually challenging able-bodied notions of desire, right? Wanting to look good and still maintain that you're definitely able-bodied. You just happen to maybe wear different clothing or have sex with different people, right? We're not actually getting to the root of desire. And I think that is what I'm most interested in, and that has been what has felt most isolating at times, being around my queer family, who I love. I'm not queer first and then disabled. I'm queer and disabled. And I think ableism must be included in our analysis of oppression and in our work as queer people, because ableism cuts across all of our movements, not just heterosexism and homophobia, but all of our movements. Because ableism dictates how bodies should function against a mythical able-bodied standard norm, right? That's built of white supremacy, heterosexism, sexism, economic exploitation, moral, religious beliefs, and age and ability, right? When we think about the kinds of bodies that are considered the norm, the kinds of bodies that people know about, even, that when you go to the doctor, the kinds of bodies that your body is being based on. Ableism and able-bodied supremacy, right? That there's a normal body that we should be trying to attain, that they directly oppress disabled people, but they also allow for the oppression of so many others. Ableism set the stage for queer and trans people to be institutionalized as mentally disabled, for intersex babies to be routinely operated on at birth, for communities of color to be understood as less capable, less smart, and less intelligent, and therefore naturally fit for slave labor, for women's bodies to be used to produce children when, where, and how men needed them, for people with disabilities to be seen as disposable in a capitalist and exploitative culture because we're not seen as productive, for immigrants to be thought of as a disease that we must cure because it's weakening our country, for violence and cycles of poverty and lack of resources and war to be used as systematic tools to construct disability in entire neighborhoods, communities, and entire countries. We think about what the impact is that war has on an entire country, an entire group of people. What happens to people's bodies when they don't have access to clean food or clean air, or they don't have access to health care, or they're being targeted by police brutality all of the time, or bombs are going off in their neighborhood or their country? So I would ask you all in this room, all the able-bodied folks and in this audience who benefit from able-bodied privilege in many different ways, right? How are you connecting your fight for queer liberation or to be in solidarity with queer folks to challenging able-bodied supremacy? How are you connecting your queerness to your able-bodied privilege? How are you listening to queer disabled people in your world? How are you listening to disabled people in your world and supporting them and practicing solidarity? I'm sure most of us, pretty much everybody knows somebody who's disabled, whether or not we think about them as disabled or not, right? Whether or not they're out as disabled, because a lot of people have what some people call hidden disabilities or invisible disabilities. A lot of folks know people who are elders, right? Who are folks who, because of age, might have disabilities. A lot of people know folks who are disabled and who claim themselves as disabled, but do we ever listen to them? Do we ever talk to them about what it's like to be disabled? Do we ever think about what our impact is on them? How are you actively noticing how ability, ableism, and able-bodied supremacy play out in queer communities, in particular, student groups, organizations, and movements? So, my longing for queer community that reflects me and where I can bring my whole self is palpable, right? I used to talk about it like that if I was, you know, when you would go to, when I would go to the beach and I would collect shells, I would like hold my shirt out and put the shells in my shirt, and it would get heavier and heavier, and I'd hold it as I kept walking down along the beach. But sometimes I think about it like if I'm picking apples and I'm like holding all these apples in my shirt, right? And that's what I feel like sometimes, like I'm walking around all the time, like just waiting to find places where I can like lay them down for a moment and just take a breath and let them kind of roll out and do whatever it is that they do. I don't know sometimes. You know, I feel like even when I was growing up, I didn't even know what that would be like. And so the first couple of places where I felt safe enough to do that, I would lay them down and then I'd have to pick them right back up because, I'd think, this is queer people of color community. I can, of course, be my whole self here. These people will understand me. And then, of course, started to talk about disability, and it's like, no, we don't actually want to talk about that here. It's more important to be disabled, to be queer and a person of color here. So that's what we're going to talk about. And then I have to pick them up and keep, and my shoulders are tired. I want to work as fast as I can with as much urgency and responsibility as I can to help create more whole spaces so that I can lay my apples down, right? So that other people can. I think the longing that we have as queer people for each other, for our families, for our people, that queer folks are, we can think about queer folks as a people that have histories and legacies. That longing is something that we carry with us. I know I do, that it's part of me, it's part of us. We love our families, but they do not always love, accept, or desire us. What do we do with that longing? Where does it go? Where does it live, right? It pushes us to build our own families with other queer people, or sometimes it pushes us away from queer people and queerness and away from ourselves into our families and communities that help us to survive, but do not truly help us to live. It pushes us to cut off the queer people we love when they hurt us or when we hurt them, because it also asks us to risk isolation, pain, and hurt again and again. That longing pushes us to choose between safety and connection, oftentimes compromising for one for the other, right? We can be safe as long as we're not connected, or we can be connected but never safe. It pushes us to build our own chosen families and relationships, but also keeps us from returning to the very families that raised us, that we were birthed into, from returning to the very places we were raised, the very land that we're from. And I think about that idea of returning a lot as an adoptee and as a queer person. What returning means for many of us as queer people, especially queer people of color, since we are oftentimes pushed out of where we are from. What returning to our land and people means, and it's not easy for all of us, and some of us have left for very good reasons, because of threats of violence, because we've had to just to be able to survive. I think about how our families and communities may not have had what they needed to be able to have kept us, or that we didn't have what we needed to be able to stay. I think about why we were given up, right, or why we chose to leave. I think about how many of us are from rural places but live in metropolitan cities because we can't go back, don't want to go back to where we came from. And I think about my own trip back to Korea for the first and second time and what it means to find family and how we create belonging in our lives. And I believe as queer people, especially queer people of color, that building family and home is hugely important and political. As a disabled person, I think that redefining home, and I think about it often as reclaiming home, is some of the most important political work we can do, especially when so many of us are forced to be in our homes because the world is inaccessible, because of the severity of ableism. So I'm part of this experiential project, like Colette talked about, To the Other Side of Dreaming, and you can find it at dreaminghome.tumblr.com. And my friend and I, Stacey Milburn, and again, right, that like, what does romantic mean? What does friend mean? She's like my platonic life partner. She's my love. She's my family. She's kin. We're both queer, disabled, Korean women of color, and so I think about her as so many things. We're not, quote unquote, like romantically or sexually involved, but we are building our lives together. And I think even that, right, when we think about what queerness means and how we creatively think about building families that are about building resiliency in our survival is even huge. To challenge the notion that only people who are partners with each other do that kind of thing. But she was living in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and I was living in Atlanta, Georgia, and she uses a power wheelchair, and we decided that we wanted to live together. And so we looked around at cities all across the country, and Berkeley, California actually was one of the most accessible city for somebody using a power wheelchair, just in terms of flat accessibility, like to buildings and on sidewalks and things like that. But also they have the country's only citywide 24-hour access PA service, emergency PA service, where you can literally pick up the phone and call because you need somebody to come and help you, and they'll be there within like 15 minutes. It's kind of amazing. You can also call for accessible taxi cabs. You can also call for wheelchair repair, and they will be there so fast. But we decided that, one, we wanted to live together because we had never lived with another disabled person. I had always grown up, my family were all able-bodied folks. My parents were white, and so I had always had whiteness at the center of my life, whether I liked it or not. And all of my immediate family are straight. And so I had never had the opportunity to, one, live with a disabled person, to center Koreanness in particular, but people of colorness, right, and to decenter whiteness, and to center queerness in that way, and with another disabled person of color, which was so exciting to me. And so we decided to live together, and we have been building home. We found a place. She moved out. We found an accessible place, which was such an experience. But I think about it as a reclaiming of home again, right? That we are figuring out what it means to build belonging and what it means to build the kind of homes that we had wished that we had grown up in, the kind of homes that we could be our whole selves in, where we can talk about disability and talk about homophobia that happens to us, and talk about how all of these things intersect, talk about what it really means to be a queer disabled woman of color. And then, within that, talk about our differences, right? Because her experience as somebody who moves through the world in a power wheelchair using a ventilator is very different than my experience with disability. And what we have found is that in talking about our similarities, so many of our differences have come up. And that, to me, has been some of the most challenging, but also the most exciting work. And I think that for myself, when I think about queerness and disability, this is where I'm locating queerness and disability right now in building home, and what that means, and how so much of queer community is so inaccessible that what we've had to do is, when Stacey moved out to the Bay, we had people who signed up for Care Shift Collective shifts, and they would come to help her use the bathroom, or to help with morning routine, to help with nighttime or bedtime routine. And they were all queer people, right? And so in some ways, there's also this other larger project of building accessible queer community and inviting our queer comrades in to start to build with them and to start to shift what queer community means and how we think about access, so that it's not even just access around disability, which of course that we have to build because people don't know what that means, but also how we think about access on a broad scale, right? Access to bathrooms for folks who have disabilities, but also to bathrooms for folks who are trans, right? For people who have different genders. Access to bathrooms for folks around different class backgrounds or who may not be able to pay an establishment to be able to use their bathrooms. Access to lots and lots of different things. Access around childcare and parenting. Access to sex and relationships, particularly as queer people, right? We know that most queer people of color community is done in private spaces, right? It's rare that you find places where queer people of color can meet in public locations. Like it's built on house parties, it's built people word of mouth, right? It's very underground most of the time. And so it's hard to have private spaces that are accessible. It's hard to figure out, I mean, even with Stacy and I, we've been talking a lot about what does it mean that I have a lot more access to people to build with them, to build, to build intimate relationships with them, whether that's just going over to somebody's house to hang out, whether that's having sex with somebody, whether that's going on a date with somebody, whether that's just even being in private space enough to flirt with somebody. And we think about what all of that means to queer people who are disabled, where most houses are not accessible. Most houses, are not, the bathrooms in particular are not wheelchair accessible. And what are realizing is that our house is becoming kind of like a center or a little bit of a meeting space because it's the only wheelchair accessible place that really exists in all of our queer community and friends that we have in the Bay Area. And so again, right, thinking about what accessible queer community means, in particular what accessible queer people of color community means. And for myself, I think about what it means to create collective access. Again, right, thinking about access on a broad scale so that we're all helping to build accessible spaces for each other. And it's not just, oh, how can we help Stacy? But how do we actually expand what access means so that we can all have accessible spaces? And it's really exciting to me because the majority of people who are coming to help are majority queer, Asian, and Pacific Islander folks, and who have never done access work before, who have never really moved in API spaces where people have talked about disability before. And so as we build deeper relationships and connections with them, and as we build family with them, like we know that queer people are great at doing, we open up space and opportunity for them to start to ask, how do I connect you all to my queer API community? And what would it take for queer API community to be accessible? I mean, for all queer community to be accessible, but in this particular example, I think what it means for Asian and Pacific Islander communities that are queer to be accessible. And the ways in which queer community excludes disabled people, right? So there was a party that was happening the other day, and Stacy wanted to go to the party, and it was being put on by a friend of ours, and it was like all about queer POC community, and it's to raise money for Safety Fest, which is a gathering of events that happens in the Bay to raise money for QAV, an organization that does transformative justice and that works specifically around with queer and trans people of color communities who are being targeted around violence. And so this was this great party. They were going to have music and drinks, and lots of folks were going to be there. Almost everybody that we knew was going. And the house wasn't wheelchair accessible though. So we were working with another disabled friend of ours, but she has chronic illness, and she's chronically ill. She's identifies as sick. And so she was working with us to try to get part of the house accessible. So she, I think, called back one day and she was like, oh, it's, I made it so that you can be in the backyard, and there's a little ramp that will go from the backyard to the kitchen. So you can be in those two places. And Stacy was like, should I go? And I just thought, I don't know, it's more than just having disabled people in the room, right? We know that just because disabled people are there doesn't mean that there's no ableism. Just because you have people of color in the room doesn't mean that there's no racism, right? Just because trans folks are there doesn't mean there's no transphobia. And I just thought, even though she would be there, would people even act right? It was going to be loud music. All the conversations would be above her head. It's the able-bodied atmosphere of having to, hold your drink and carry on conversations and maybe hold a plate of food if they had food. Everybody trying to look good, maybe get laid. Also, trying to look cute. Are people going to act right in that kind of an environment? Do we even have the skills yet or the resources in our communities to be able to even know what building with, if there were disabled folks there, would be like, right? And knowing that she and I would probably be the only physically disabled people there. folks who have non-normative bodies in a disability sense, right? Which is really different than a lot of our chronically ill friends, right? Or friends who suffer from chronic pain or who identify as sick, right? That there's a difference in that, and that there's a very distinct difference, you know, that she and I definitely have, that I can walk upright, right? And that I'm level with where most people have conversations. And so we just had this long talk about that, and about how that being isolated from that space isolates her from building with queer community, in particular queer people of color community, and how that isolates queer people of color community from building with her. And we had made a deal before we went out that we wouldn't go, if we were both invited to places, we wouldn't go if it wasn't accessible for the other one. So we both didn't end up going. But I think it's a really great example of that we want to move beyond access. We don't want it to just be, oh, this space is accessible, you can get in the door. But we want to actually start to challenge what a culture of ableism looks like, what a queer culture of ableism looks like, and how we've totally ingested ableism in our queer movements, in our queer communities, as a way of connecting with each other that totally disconnects other people. And who does it disconnect from us? Good, yes. So I know that we're getting on time, and so I want to make sure that we have time for a Q&A. And I just want to say just quickly that part of to the other side of dreaming for me has been a huge amount about being an adoptee and what home means for me as an adoptee, right, who's queer and disabled, and as somebody who has never had access to people who are like me, even in the smallest ways, and that has been very powerful as well, and to center even the possibility that home could exist in another way that didn't equal me having to isolate parts of myself or cut off parts of myself or cut myself right down the middle, that I could actually stay connected to myself and be home, I think has been very powerful. So I want us to strive to build movements and organizations and student groups and communities where we can bring our whole selves. I like to say where we can be whole and connected and not have to sacrifice one or the other, not have to say, I can be connected here as long as I'm not whole. I can be here as long as I don't talk about what it means to be an adoptee. As long as I don't talk about queerness, I can be in disabled spaces. As long as I don't talk about disability, I can be in racial justice spaces. I don't want that. I don't want that. I don't want to have to feel like I have to leave my community in order to be whole. That is not what we are talking about when we think about liberation. Our queerness, I do believe, just like our stories, are tools for liberation as well, because again, it's more than just who we sleep with, right? It's more than just who we're attracted to. It's about how we value and create relationships. It's about how we love ourselves and each other. I truly believe that queerness is about how we love, especially for queer people of color, who have always had to figure out how to love ourselves because nobody else is going to. It's about even the possibility of radical transformative love, even the possibility that that could exist. And it's also about how we desire and the power of our desires to create a different world for all of us and not just some of us. And it's this desire that I want to close with. Disability necessarily queers relationships, and in the best cases offers an opportunity to build deeper and stronger connections that are firmly grounded in difference. In the worst case, ableism lays the groundwork for abuse, manipulation, and violence. Queer disability pushes us to confront our bodies and minds and wrestle desire and stigma to the ground until queer able-bodied people refuse to move forward without queer disabled people at every turn. Who do we desire to be, and what kinds of communities and activism and movements do we desire? What kind of radical allies and solidarity do we desire? How do we desire to be with each other? How do we desire to work with each other? I believe it's about bringing our desire into our lives and our work every day in ways that make us more whole and keep us connected. It's about using our desires in ways that bring us closer to liberation. Now that is queer. It's about valuing all the different ways that we as queer people are queered, about valuing all of us and not just some of us. And I think that we can imagine better ways of loving and fighting for each other. I know that we can. We can honor and challenge each other. We can be save and to exist. We can make mistakes, and we can complex, and who can be brave enough to change ourselves, institutions around us. We can love to community at all costs and not allow it to be prevented. Thank you all. Do you need to do something different?
No, just this one. And then we'll
To change it?
questions. Yeah.
Oh, that's for you, because you're going to be Phil Donahue, right? Can I sit down, though?
Yes,
Can I pull up a chair?
Why don't I pull a chair?
Thanks for having me on your show, Lisa.
Oh, you're welcome. Anytime. I love it. All right, there you go. Here we go. All right, so we'll take...
Oh, there's a clock right there.
Yep, there we go. Okay, questions for Mia? I know there are some. Ah, yes, I knew it.
It's okay if there's not.
Hi, thank you. You talked about, your desire for that completely open space where you can lay down all your apples, right, for lack of a better term. And you did talk about it like quite a bit, but do you have like specific advice for us for building those kinds of spaces, particularly if we're not, necessarily the heads of organizations or anything, like if we're just in our own spaces or we're in a space where people are meeting, like how best can we build those kinds of spaces where everyone can be free to express all parts of their identity?
Thank you.
Maybe I could just talk. I feel like there's so many ways. I'm going to hold this. But I know, like, for disability, there's even small ways, right? Like starting when you have a room, starting with an access check-in. Are there any things that people might need? Putting on your flyers or for events that things are accessible and how they're accessible. Asking for people to be scent free or fragrance free. Making sure that not just that people can get in the room, but that the room is arranged in ways that people can actually move around and actually talk with folks. I think able-bodied folks in particular can start by having conversations with other able-bodied people around how to do your own work and what it means and what this process of kind of confronting your able-bodied privilege looks like. I think it also starts with talking and listening to the people who you want to create whole spaces for. There's so many different ways, right, when we think about like all different types of people, but I know that that's some of the ways that we've tried to start to create whole spaces for us. And I think also the piece around creating whole spaces is that, hopefully it's open enough that folks feel good enough to say what they need, but they may not. And so it might mean also checking in with people beforehand, one-on-one, just to make sure, until you can start to anticipate things. But I wish I had like a whole booklet to give you or something.
Other questions? Come on front so I can see your hands. All right, so I'm going to ask you a question, Mia.
Oh, God.
As folks are still thinking, could you talk a little bit about the history of the disability rights versus justice movement? If you could talk a little bit about the frames, that would be great.
Definitely. So disability rights, and when I say disability justice, I'm talking about a specific movement, as Lisa said. So the disability rights movement is probably what most of you all are familiar with, who helped to pass the ADA, the Americans with Disability Act. They're responsible for the, disabled parking spaces outside. A hugely responsible for making transportation accessible as well. That started out with the Greyhound buses. But the difference is there's very different approaches. And so the disability rights movement has largely been led by, and the people who are given the power in it, which is different than the folks who have always been doing the work, because lots and lots of different disabled folks have been doing the work but have never gotten any recognition or visibility or had any of the institutional backing or power to make decisions, has largely been, white, very male, or folks who are assigned as men. A lot of veterans have been a huge piece of that. A lot of people with physical disabilities. You'll see less. I feel like folks who have cognitive disabilities, mental disabilities, folks with psych histories, they were definitely pushed to the margins and downright ignored and silenced. A lot of folks with class privilege, a lot of parents who were pushing for their children, able-bodied parents who were pushing for their disabled child to be able to have, everything that everybody else has. And so we think about the disability rights movement, it was very much an equality-based, rights-based movement. Like, you hear things like, we're just as good as you, we deserve the same things as everybody else does, we want to be equal to you. And disability justice is a very different kind of movement, saying we don't just want to be just like you, we actually want to question what it means to be like you, and that to be like you requires other people's exploitation, requires other people's oppression. We don't just want to join the ranks of the privileged few, we actually want to dismantle privilege and talk about redistribution and talk about what justice for all of us would look like. And in disability justice, which is grounded much more in community organizing and justice and liberation, a framework of justice and liberation, rather than looking to the courts and the government for protection, which is what the disability rights movement have historically done. And a lot of that is because the communities that they were led by were communities who do look to the courts and the government for protection. Whereas in disability justice, led by a lot of people of color, immigrant folks, queer folks, trans folks, women of color, who never really looked to the courts or the government to protect us anyways. We were looking to be protected from them. We were looking to figure out how to get them, to stop violating us, right? So that the approach is very different, which is not to say that one's better or worse, because we do need people who are doing work on the public policy side, because there are very, very real threats coming down the pipe that do affect us, particularly those of us who don't have the privilege or the luxury of not having the state in our lives, right? For folks who don't have a choice of whether or not they have SSI benefits or whether or not they're going to be in the state institution for life. For people who don't have a choice, right? There are dangerous policies that are coming down, and of course, the whole political policy advocacy world is very inaccessible and made that way so that only privileged folks can access it. And though, with disability justice, what we found was there was a huge gap of people that were being left out of the conversation. And there was a whole different way of thinking about what political change, social change could look like for disabled folks that wasn't just grounded in policy changes or court cases or suing people, that was actually grounded in impacting the everyday lived realities of people's lives and building community. And doing community organizing. And so for myself, like I said, the disability justice movement as we know it now in a more formalized way is very new, but the work has been going on forever. I mean, disabled people of color, for example, we have always been figuring out ways to survive and figuring out ways to connect with people, to connect with our communities, whether they're able-bodied or not, what have you, to figure out how to straddle the lines between white disabled community and able-bodied people of color community, but that it hadn't been named or called disability justice till very recently. And I should say the other piece that I think differentiates disability justice work from disability rights work is the disability rights work has historically been hard to sometimes pull apart from what I would call disability services, right? And the actual services that people are receiving that oftentimes colludes with the medical industrial complex and forces people to identify and define their disability along medical terms. And that shift has been huge, I think, with the disability justice movement. So I don't know if that helps you all.
Comment with the mic.
Can you talk some more about disability pride and seeing disability as beautiful and desirable. I think that for a lot of people, this might be the first time they're hearing that kind of thing, and I know that it sometimes blows people's minds.
Yes. Well, so disability pride is another thing that came out of the disability rights movement. Like, even that phrase, people didn't really start saying that even till after the impact that the disability rights movement had. And it was this shift in thinking of people being proud to be disabled, people suddenly starting to be like, disability is sexy. Sometimes people will say there's a button that says lame is sexy. And so folks who were starting to do pornography that had disabled people in it. People were starting to have, there's 2 disability pride parades. I believe it's Chicago and in Berkeley. Or Berkeley's maybe like very, very new. Chicago, I think, was the only one. And so disabled people starting to be out in public celebrating, and a lot of that was because also the gains made by the disability rights movement, because people couldn't even be out in public because things were so inaccessible. But once things started to shift, people taking to the streets, with balloons, and it's like a whole parade now. But this idea of disability as being beautiful and not being something that's thought of as like an individual flaw or a tragedy or something that's sad, but actually something that is a powerful way to move through the world, and something that's sexy and that people would want, like not just because they couldn't be able-bodied, but that it actually is desirable in and of itself. And so there's a lot of folks who do all kinds of different things, who have blogs and zines and take pictures. I know there was I can't remember her name, but there's a famous disabled athlete who was like in Playboy or something, and she was an amputee, and so that was like a huge deal that happened in the 80s, I think. But again, right, I think it's still hard for folks to even start to shift people's ideas. I was just at the Sins Invalid performance, which is an organization that deals with disability and sexuality, and they do performance art on disability and sexuality, and they had their annual show last weekend, and there was all disabled artists on stage, and a lot of them were, all of them were grappling with what sexuality and disability means in particular. But there was a lot of really beautiful and hot performances from folks who were using their disability in like lots of different ways to be sexy. And also showing that too, because I think there's like this internal culture of disability that people don't get to see, like the Ellery Russian, she rolled up in her wheelchair. She's an amputee, and she's a double amputee, and she was like saying her piece as she took off her prosthetic legs and like went through the whole process and like got herself ready for bed, and it was just like there's something so sexy about it. But I don't think that people really, those are not the stories that we see. Those are not the images that we see when we're looking at what's desirable. You rarely see disabled people.
Comment.
I think there's one in the back too, Phil.
Did I miss somebody in the back? Oh, okay, I'll come for you next. Absolutely. Okay.
I guess I just have a question as far as person first language. And I didn't know, I just recently found out more that some people in the disability community are not for person first language, which is the person before the disability. And so I was just wondering what your views were on that, and if you had any insight as to why. Because I was actually, as a person with a disability, I'm always person first language. I'm Lucia with a disability, not, this and that. And so I was actually very surprised that people were not for that. So if you could just enlighten me a little bit, that would be great.
Well, I can give you my thoughts. I mean, I don't know that they're the right way, but I like saying disabled because it speaks, I think it's a political term, and to me, so it both points to maybe the lack of person first language, but I think about it like queerness, like I'm queer. I'm not like Mia of queerness. That sounds like I'm a queen or something. But I like it because I feel like I can't separate myself from having a disability, and so I've always been, and I think also because my disability has been closer to like the norm, that's always been put on me by doctors, and most of my childhood was like people kind of being like, you know, you could be normal if we could just fix this leg, you could be normal. And so claiming disabled as like something that I can't separate from myself feels really good to me. It also feels less politically correct and more kind of like a reclamation, which feels more political to me just for myself, and I like it. As well as I think that for a lot of folks, we are, you know, that's the narrative, like the narrative I talked about. That is the narrative. Like, oh, you just, you know, you're just Lucy and you happen to have a disability. And I'm like, no, I actually don't want that. I'm like, it's part of my full self. Kind of with the pride, yeah. But I know that it's very different for folks. You know, people have different experiences which lead them to name themselves differently, and I support however people want to name themselves, particularly those of us who have been named by other people for so long.
Mia, could you talk a little bit about, no,
Okay.
he passed. Could you talk a little bit about the models of disability, the social model, the medical model? Just touch on it a little bit and kind of how it's played out in organizing in our society.
So there's two kind of main models that you'll hear about if you ever start learning about disability, anything really. The first is the medical model, and the medical model was kind of the way that it had always been before the disability rights movement came about. The medical model was grounded in medicine and science, and that was how disability got defined. You were defined by whatever illness you had, however the medical industry defined you, that was what your disability is. So I'll use myself as an example. So my disability was that I had polio, right? That was how I was defined. You were defined by your impairment. And a lot of people will make the distinction that impairment is descriptive, like I have, 3 fingers, or I can't hear out of 1 ear, I have 1 leg. Whereas disability was I'm only disabled then when I interact with an inaccessible world, right? A world where there's ableism. Then only then is where that's where my disability gets constructed, is what you heard in the social model. The medical model was very much grounded in the individual. It was about your body, the body is wrong, this individual body is wrong, and it was about you are just a person, you just happen to have a disability. If it's on you to fix yourself, to cure yourself, to make everything more comfortable for everybody else. And you didn't really hear any kind of connection to a broader community. And then the social model, which came about through the disability rights movement, was a huge shift, right? It was grounded in social conditions and access and power and privilege, right? It was...
Ooh, sorry.
Are we okay? Okay.
That was me. I almost dropped the mic. Sorry. Mia, please.
It was grounded in social conditions and power and privilege, and it was much more collective. So you started to hear things like, the world is wrong. Not my body is wrong, but the world is wrong. And again, disability then getting defined as by access and oppression. So people would start to say, disability is not bad. Again, getting back to disability pride. Like, my impairment is not bad. It's when I interact with the world, or when I have to come in contact with people, that then I feel disabled. And it was the social model of disability, meaning that what we need to change are social conditions. The medical model, meaning that what we need to change and the changes that need to be made are medical, and through the medical industrial complex. And I think what disability justice would say is that we want something that neither one is neither one is the end-all be-all, that we want something that's actually kind of in between that's much more complicated, because we don't want, I feel like sometimes in the social model, it's like, if every building was accessible and all the right policies were passed, then we would all be free. All disabled people, there would be no more ableism, right? Like, because if we change the world, then we'll be fine. But I think it doesn't speak to our bodies. Like, chronic pain is real. It doesn't speak to a lot of different pieces about that. Even if all the conditions around me change, there's still going to be things I can't do. There's still going to be limits to my body that are medical. And again, we can think about medical in lots and lots of different terms, right? There's going to be things that I need different kinds of care for that may not be through the medical industrial complex, but could be through health and wellness or holistic practices. But that we don't lose the body. I always say, we can swing through the air on a vine screaming socially constructed all day long, but eventually we hit a wall, and I think that wall is our bodies. And so I think what I would say is that those two models are really useful, and definitely the social model totally expanded what disabled people could do and how we could even be thought of. But with disability justice, I think we want to bring back the body, and so that we're not all, ringing our bell and wearing our I love my disability sandwich sign all day long, that we're actually having complex conversations about, like, sometimes it's really hard to have a disability, and it doesn't mean that I hate myself. It means that it's hard to have a disability. What does that look like? And those kind of conversations, I feel like, are where we want to get to. And again, I don't want to slam the disability rights movement, because I think they had to go there because the ableism was so severe. But now, because of the work that they've done and the shift that they've made, we're able to have a little bit more leeway to talk about some of the things, the deeper things that we would like to talk about.
Great, thank you. We'll take one more question, two more questions, and then we'll wrap up, because I know we're starting to get to the time where folks need to get to class. All right, we'll start here. There you go, thank you.
I really don't like mics. I have cerebral palsy, and I have always struggled with being identified as disabled, actually kind of the opposite thing. Like, my whole thing has always been, I'm human first. I'd rather you see me as human. It doesn't really matter, like, that I walk differently, or it doesn't really matter that I struggle with this or that. So much so that it's probably hindered me in some ways to be so adamant. But yesterday I was talking with a community service agency. They had asked to interview me because I'm an AmeriCorps member, and they wanted to know what it's like to have a disability while you're doing community service. And they kept making some very interesting assumptions about how I got to community service and what my experience was like, and I just didn't know how to respond. I mean, they were like, well, you were referred by this disability agency, weren't you? And I was like, no, and I was having a hard time interacting with them and their assumptions without being like, hey, like, you're very wrong here at a root level, like, you're making the assumption that I couldn't do this on my own. And that's really hard for me. So I was wondering how you have been able to interact with individuals who, by their very nature, their assumptions are just wrong. They're not trying to be mean. These people were not trying to be horrible or evil people. They were just completely wrong. And I was just like, I don't know how to talk to you. And so I just kind of let it go. And I made small corrections to the language along the way, but that's kind of all I could do. And I was wondering if you had any more feedback for me as to how to go about that.
How to deal with well-intentioned able-bodied people. Yeah. I mean, it's really hard. I feel like ableism is one of those things to push back on that we don't even have the backing. Not that it's easy to push back against racism or sexism or any of the other things. Not that those are easy, but I feel like we even have less when we push back against ableism because it's so much the norm. It so undergirds all of our notions around whose bodies are desirable and not desirable and valuable. And so, even pushing back against language, I feel like can be very hard and can be. I've been in situations where people get really volatile. That they're like, "This, I'm not trying to be bad," because it's like on the flip side, of the stereotype is that you're not supposed to be mean to disabled people. Like people are so scared of saying the wrong things, and exactly, right. So you're like caught in a catch-22, and. I think you have to feel it out, hopefully, and make sure that you're safe enough, and that also you are like ready to take that on if it happens, because sometimes it's just been a mess, and other times I say things and I'm like, did they hear me what I just said? I don't know if they heard. Like, they just keep going on. So,
and a lot of times what I feel the burden of like I have to take care of them.
Yes,
like,
yes.
Yeah. With the situation, and I have to take care of them and their emotions and reassure them and make sure that they know that I don't hate them because they're ignorant. Like,
like, I felt so responsible in that moment, and I was just like, I hung up the phone. Like, I never want to do that again. You know, and it was so overwhelming for me. So I just,
That's right.
I'm a strong person. Everyone knows that, and I want to be a voice, but I'm often so frustrated with where the voice ends up putting me, or the boxes I put in as I speak up, like that I just don't even want to deal with that. So first of all, thank you for speaking up, because I don't know if I can ever do it, but it doesn't mean I don't want to. I fear those boxes and those assumptions, because I was always raised to never think of myself as disabled.
Right.
I mean, I have a disability, can't hide it. But I mean, I'll stand on tables and people will be like, "Why are you standing on a table?"
Yeah, yeah.
You can't do that. And so those basic things are just, I never know how to explain it to people. I mean, explaining it to a 3-year-old is easier than explaining it to an adult.
I know, right? And you would think. But I mean, I think it's like any system, any, axis of oppression and privilege, like it's not on folks, it shouldn't be on us to have to explain everything and educate everything. So I think also to be gentle with ourselves, that sometimes if we don't say anything, that it's okay, because we do it all the time, and it's like incessant, the same thing like for folks of color or queer folks, whoever, that's hopefully why we need folks who are working, doing able-bodied people who are doing work with other able-bodied people, and hopefully it becomes like a can't eat, can't sleep, can't breathe kind of thing for them too. That's not just for us, to fight ableism every day. And I wish I had like a one-size-fits-all thing, but it's so different. Yeah.
No, I understand.
And it's especially hard when there's like multiple things happening at once, like multiple privileges and oppressions happening at the same time, because that's really difficult.
So we'll take our last question here. I think you.
This might be too long for you to answer. The answer might be too long, but you were talking about the medical model, and then you were talking about, the social model. And my observation, I work for a company that employs 4,000 people. Presently, 1 out of 5 are 55 or older. By 2015, 2 out of 5 will be 55 or older. What I continue to raise the flag about is these people are going to probably work until they're 67 to 70. There's going to be a lot of disabilities involved in that. I think that's a social model, not a medical model, and that we need to spread the word in our society that get ready with this, because there's going to be a lot of people, and I'm not talking about all these people requesting accommodations. I think that we need to accommodate them, period. Just be ready.
Right. Yes, I agree.
I guess it was, I wanted it in the form of a question, like, how do you think we can get ready for that? How do you raise the flag for this?
I mean, I think it's kind of connects with your question, actually, like around how do we begin to think about universal accessibility just all the time and push for that, whether there's disabled people in the room or not, or who need it. Right, exactly. Right, and that it shouldn't be exactly what you're saying, that every single one of those people have to ask for it. That should not have to be the case. I mean, hopefully people are already thinking about universal design and how to make things universally accessible. So I feel like that's pushing for that seems like it makes the most sense. Or change the world for disability. Yes, we're working on that too. Okay, thank you all.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to pass it to Colette to close us out here. And there we go.
And just to say thank you very much to Mia. Yay. And please, thank you. And please give us your feedback by filling out one of the evaluations. Thank you.